Hi everyone, and welcome to Deep Geek Live. This is a solo live stream. I should probably say first up, for those of you expecting Gemma, I originally advertised this as being something that I'm going to be doing with Secrets of the Citadel. Unfortunately, she's a bit unwell today, so it's just me. But I'm very excited because we are going to be talking about this beautiful thing. Fire and Blood. Guys, I'll be honest, I just finished it about 2 hours ago, and there is so much information in there, and I've got so many great questions. I'm going to be running it the same way that I'd normally run my live stream, so I've got a whole load of questions from my patrons. Obviously, if any super chats come up, then we'll come to them as well. Couple of things first up. I just wanted to say, I know this is for many of you, if you're in America, this is Thanksgiving, and happy Thanksgiving to you. I am very thankful, I have to say, for everyone who supports this channel. So if you're watching this, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. But let's just get a few other things out of the way first. This is a big book. It's 700 and something pages long. There is a lot of extra history in there. And one thing I would say that I'm really looking forward to is going through this as a community and trying to pick out the details and see the things that each of us noticed and trying to identify what are the really important things that we've got going on, because there is so much detail in here. I will be honest, I'm sure I missed some stuff on my first read through. I'm going to have another read through and I'm sure I'll pick up more stuff, and I'm sure other creators and you, if you've read it already, you will have picked up on stuff that I haven't. So I'm really looking forward to that process of going through it and exchanging ideas. So that said, quick review before getting into the questions. I really like it. I just think it's fantastically written. It's for those who haven't read it yet, it is very much in the vein of The World of Ice and Fire, the kind of the history book. It is written from the perspective of Archmaester Gildane. So one of the things that we have to accept in all of this is that we shouldn't treat this as sort of true history. This is history from the perspective of one person. He is picking out the bits of history that he wants us to see and understand, and he is giving he's got his own slant on things. And what this means is that we have got a character who's a maester, who is clearly very much on their side of things. There are some characters, some kings, queens, that he really likes. Jaehaerys, for example, he's quite a fanboy, and Septon Bart as well is a huge fanboy of him. Other characters, less so. So Mushroom, for example, he doesn't really he finds Mushroom very crude, and everything that might be considered to be crude, he kind of looks down on a bit. So one could almost see him as being socially conservative, let's say. So he brings this whole baggage in with him. So everything we're reading about is from his perspective. And I probably won't mention that again, but it's worth remembering, because we shouldn't take this as the kind of the absolute truth. So Karen Pierre, I just saw in the chat talking about, is this like the Silmarillion? Is this George R.R. Martin's Silmarillion? Sort of, but this is not written from a kind of an omnipotent third-person perspective. This is written very clearly from the perspective of a character within the world, revealing the things that that they want you to know about. So let's get into it. But first of all, we had a super chat even before we went on air. Kelly Lausman, thank you so much. That's very kind. $10. I really appreciate that. I don't know whether you're there. I haven't seen you in the chat yet, but thank you. That's very kind. I'll start with questions from Maura Lee, one of my patrons, who I don't know whether is going to be able to make it today, but this is quite a good way to get into this. What were my first impressions? She asks. Favorite parts, and is there anything that I was really excited to learn about that I didn't already know? So my first impressions were big, very detailed. There are a lot more characters here for us to know. There's a lot more history for us to grapple with. Some bits of it we knew pretty much already. Like Aegon's conquest. There are a few little tweaks and things on there, but the broad strokes of it, and in fact the broad strokes of history across the piece, are not changed. There's no huge game changer here that makes us view absolutely everything in a completely different way. There are some things that were conspicuous by their absence, like there was a little bit of teasing or trolling from George R.R. Martin that maybe we'll be learning a bit about whether Aegon the Conqueror invaded Westeros in the first place because he knew about the threat from the others. There's nothing about that here. That's not there. The others are pretty much not a part of this story. This is a story of the Targaryens. So that was my first impression. There's a lot of extra stuff there. My favorite part, broadly speaking, is the section George R.R. Martin said this was his favorite section to write, which is the section about Jaehaerys and Alicent. And it's very clear, if you're looking at the way it's written, the first bit, we rattle through the first bit with the Conquest and the first three kings, and then we get to Jaehaerys, and the pace slows, and we get a lot more human interest stories, a lot more anecdotes, a lot more conversations that we get that we have recorded between different characters, and we actually get into the understanding characters and plots as they develop, rather than just sort of the high level of stuff. Then we sort of move on a bit later. The Dance with the Dragons, there was a lot of extra information going on there. I really enjoyed what was going on in King's Landing there. Perhaps we'll talk about that a bit later. And then it sort of, for me, it sort of moved more into sort of the history side again. So the bit that I liked the most was the bit with Jaehaerys and Alicent and that element there. So let's go on to Lady Elaine Fairchild saying, an old question, but I'm still wondering what you think was in the letter sent to Aegon by Prince Nymor. A couple of people asked this, somebody else did. I'll probably pick up on this one again. So, and I should say, spoilers, guys. I should have said that at the beginning. If you've not read all of the book, then I will be talking about bits from different parts of the book. So if you want to stop, buy the book, read it first, that's great. Incidentally, if you do want to buy it, there is an affiliate link down in the description, which doesn't cost you anything extra, but does support the channel. But in terms of this question about the letter that was sent to Aegon by Prince Nymor, this is something that we knew about already, and we don't get huge amounts of extra information, but this was after the Conquest, and the Conquest, we often think of it as being a thing that just happened very quickly, but in reality, it took place over a few years, over about 3 or 4 years, actually. And the one part of Westeros that resisted all the way through was Dorne. And in fact, they resisted even after hostilities had ended. They retained their independence for quite a long time. Now, the way that they did that was that whenever the dragons came in and the armies invaded, the Dornish just disappeared. Or at least the Dornish army just disappeared. We don't know where they went. They're hiding in mountains, maybe underground somewhere. We're not entirely sure. But the moment that the dragons went away again, up popped the army, killed any of the Targaryen army that was left there, and they just went through this whole thing again. And there were a number of these iterations of dragons coming in, burning stuff down, towns, cities, castles burnt to the ground, crops burnt to the ground, and this went on many, many iterations. Dragons go away, the Dornish come back, kick out whoever's left over, and then they carry on. But this was starting to cause huge amounts of pain on both sides. So we already get Rhaenys, who dies in this battle, and her dragon as well, who dies, and lots of other really important people on the Targaryen side died in these battles. And in Dorne, then people were starving because the dragons were coming in and burning down all the crops. And it was just turning into this stalemate, and Dorne were just saying, well, we're never going to give in. And the Targaryens were just keeping on going. But then finally we get this letter, which goes from Prince Nymor, who was head of the Dornish at the time, to King Aegon. And we do not know what was in this letter. The letter was hand-delivered. Nobody else read it. Aegon opened it. He read it. And the description we have is that his hands formed fists. I think it was on the Iron Throne itself, so tight that they drew blood. And then he burnt the letter, said nothing. He flew off to Dragonstone, came back the next day and said, that's it, we'll just have peace. And so the question is, what's in this letter? Now, George R.R. Martin has left it deliberately vague, so we do not know. And in fact, in the book, we get a number of different possible solutions. Archmaester Gildain gives us a number of different options. I like the idea that it wasn't a threat. It wasn't that this can carry on forever. We'll do this. We'll hire faceless men, anything like that. I like the idea that it was actually just a plea to his heart, to his humanity. And that was the reason why he didn't say anything, because he knew he had to appear strong. But really, this was you've already lost one of your wives. There's a chance that you might lose another one, or maybe even you. This could go on terribly. Your children could die, as could mine. Why don't we just be big people and not fight? I hope that's what it was, but we don't know. It could have been a threat, but I don't think that Aegon was the kind of person who would have just backed down over a threat, to be honest. I think it had to have been an appeal to his heart in some way. LMC, $20. Thank you. That's very kind. Saying, this is in support of your new haircut. Looking good. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Yeah, I had it cut just this last week. So Elaine Fairchild, thank you for your question. Susan Dunkel, was Melisandre involved in Aegon's conquest? I don't think so. No, I don't think we've got any hint of that. There's no hint of any Red Priests being involved in that process at all. The Targaryens had their own rites and religions and weren't reliant on the worship of the Lord of Light. So even if Melisandre were around, personally, I don't think that she was involved, and we certainly didn't get any evidence of it in Fire and Blood. Miss M. Dub saying about the Dornish issue, it might have been something to do with the Dornish unwillingness to ally as the Seventh Kingdom against the others. I think possibly, but I also, in terms of, as I was saying earlier, in terms of the things that weren't said, there is not only is there nothing in here that says that Aegon had a vision of the others, there's also no evidence that that's what he prioritized doing when he got to Westeros. He came in, it took him decades, over 3 decades, to actually even go to Winterfell, and we don't hear of him going to the Wall at all. He may have done, but this doesn't seem to have been a priority. The North doesn't seem to have been what he's been caring about at all. He had lots of battles in the South. His focus seems to have been building his own kingdom, his own empire, not looking to the North and protecting against the others. So I think that that's just a misdirection on the part of George R.R. Martin. But talking of which, Warrior Girl asks, is there any mention of the North and maybe some dragons flying up there? Well, yes, there is. There are 2 big examples we have, and a general idea that the Targaryens did go up to the North, probably a bit more than we previously imagined they did. Now, in terms of the sort of the generalities, what seems to have happened, particularly with King Jaehaerys, but also with the others, or most of the others, the kings went on what's called a progress around the land. This is something that would happen, for example, in Henry VIII's court in England back in the Tudor times, that the whole court would head off around the country, and so you would bring the king to the people. And Jaehaerys did this a lot. He would sort of go off for 6 months at a time and stop off at various different towns and cities so that the people could see uh, they could see the dragons, and he could dispense justice around the Seven Kingdoms. So that seems to have happened, and it's not mentioned huge amounts, but sometimes they did seem to go to the north. Most of the time when they went to the north, it has to be said they only really went as far as White Harbour. Sometimes they went up to Winterfell. We don't hear much at all of them going much further north than that, because although the kings and queens could fly there on dragons, and that wouldn't take quite such a long time, everybody else had to come following up on the King's Road, or in fact, the King's Road only came into existence with Jaehaerys I. So before that, it was just muddy tracks. That would have taken months. So they did visit the north. We get two more detailed descriptions of what happened. The second one, probably less interesting. We didn't know about it, but this was just before the Dance of the Dragons. We didn't know about this before. This is where the rumor comes of there perhaps being some dragon eggs that are at Winterfell, because the dragon that went up there allegedly laid some eggs that were allegedly stayed there. There's no external evidence of this. It's just a story, but that's one incident. The other one, which was actually in the pre-released sections, one of the pre-released sections from Fire and Blood that we got, was when Queen Alicent goes up north. Jaehaerys stays down in King's Landing. He's dealing with some diplomacy with Braavos and Tyrosh, I think it is, some of the free cities anyway. And so she goes off, and she starts off in White Harbour, and then she heads off from there. She goes up to Winterfell, and from Winterfell she goes up to the Wall. Now, this is one of the fascinating bits about it, and one of the takeaways, one of the questions I'll come to later, is what are the takeaways potentially for A Song of Ice and Fire here, is that we get that fantastic section when she's at the Wall on her dragon Silverwing, and she's thinking that she wants to fly north. And so she does. She gets on Silverwing. She tries to fly north, and her dragon refuses to go. Now, that's created. We don't get any reason for this. It doesn't say this was because of X, Y, and Z. So we're left to speculate. Now, there are two obvious possible things going on here. One is that the dragon cannot pass the Wall. Now, that is possible because the Wall is a magical barrier, not just a physical barrier. Pardon me. And it's very clear that it's a barrier between Jon and Ghost when they're on either sides of the Wall, that the connection isn't there. It's very clear that it's a barrier for the others. So it kind of makes sense perhaps that it might be a barrier for dragons, but it's also possible that the Silverwing just doesn't want to go north and senses that there's something evil over there and decides not to go. And this is one of the themes that does come out from Fire and Blood, is the fact that dragons are not biddable. Yes, you can form a bond with a dragon, but the dragon will do what it wants to do. And it would appear, the first time that this particular dragon had done that, and it really kind of upset Queen Alicent because she thought she was in control of the dragon. Dragons are not horses or dogs to be trained. They will do what they want. So those were the two big incidents we've got there. Scott McCloy, thank you very much for the super chat. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on the 3 stolen dragon eggs. Yes, I'm going to come to that. We've got a couple of questions on that coming up. So I'll wrap all of that up. And B1 Merry, $25. Thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you too. Hope everyone is enjoying their day with family and good friends. Say a prayer for our police community. Today is a very busy and dangerous day for them. Love to all. So thank you for that message. And again, if you're in America and it is Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving to you. And do spare a thought for the people who aren't relaxing and having a nice time, but are actually working. So shall we get on to the dragon eggs? Now, this is, I think, one of the other big takeaways. I don't know how much this impacts on the story, although I will speculate in a moment. But what we've got is a story from the time of King Jaehaerys, when we get a character called Elissa Farmen. Now, Elissa Farmen was one of the favorites in the court at Dragonstone, but she had this great desire to travel, and there's quite a big, long, complicated backstory. But basically, she leaves Dragonstone and ends up in Braavos, which is everybody knows and accepts. And as she goes, 3 dragon eggs go missing. Now, she then mysteriously gets a lot of money that she spends on building a magnificent ship, because she wants to go sailing around off the Sunset Sea. She wants to go west and just keep on going. Now, the clear implication is that she stole 3 dragon eggs, she went to Braavos, and she sold them. Now, this could be to anyone, but we then get a little bit later, Jaehaerys, understandably, although he's not as bothered by this as you might think initially, because his thought is that actually, you know what, dragon eggs just don't hatch. They need to be in the right conditions. That Dragonstone seems to be the best place for dragon eggs to hatch by quite a long way. That seems to be where most of the dragons hatch. And so he's not that bothered, because he thinks, well, they're not going to hatch. They're just like nice looking baubles now. Anyway, he sends his Hand of the King, Septon Bart, he sends him over to Braavos to talk to the first Sea Lord, to the Sea Lord who is effectively in charge, the political leader and ruler of Braavos. And the conversation, we have it recorded, because Septon Bart is one of the characters who does history within this world, and he is quoted by Archmaester Gildane, and he does verbatim what the conversation is. And it's very clear that although the Sea Lord isn't going to be admitting that he has these eggs, because they are stolen eggs, why would you admit it? He does implicitly say, yes, okay, if I had them, what would be the price that I would have to pay for this problem to go away? And so they negotiate an amount of money that basically means that the crown's debts against the Iron Bank get forgiven. So that long story cuts down to somebody Elissa Farmen stole 3 dragon's eggs, took them over to Braavos, sold them to the Sea Lord. So there are in Braavos, which is not too far from where we next see them, in the sort of the northwest of Essos, 3 dragon eggs. And of course, then we get Illyrio Mopatis, who produces these 3 dragon eggs and gives them to Dany as a present. Now, it's a takeaway on one aspect, because it means that this seems to explain where they come from. Secondly, it suggests that perhaps either Illyria, we've still got a huge amount of time here. Let's not forget that was like 200 years before the events that we're talking about in A Song of Ice and Fire. So we don't know what happened after there, but it would seem a little bit odd for these dragon eggs to be sold off again. But who knows? So Illyrio Mopatis says that he got them off from the Far East. So that doesn't quite add up. But it does add in the possibility, and this is speculation at this point, but it does add in the possibility that perhaps Illyrio is still quite tied up not only with this idea of trying to get Aegon onto the throne, but also with this wider plot that has been developing with Dawn in A Song of Ice and Fire, with Dawn and Braavos to be potentially getting Dany and the Targaryens back in power, because that would make sense of why the Sea Lord would have gifted these dragon eggs, or sold these dragon eggs to Illyrio, knowing that they would end up with Dany. Of course, and I hope you're still following this one because it's quite a long thread, but the Sea Lord in the present day of A Song of Ice and Fire also had another role in being the witness to a marriage pact between Viserys and Arianne, who was Arianne Martell and Viserys Targaryen, when they were still very, very young. And this implies that Braavos is a lot more involved in this than we perhaps originally thought. And this, just what we learn in Fire and Blood, just adds to that idea. So I think this is probably going to turn into a video for me, because there's a lot more digging going on here of exactly what's going on with this massive plot with Dawn and Braavos and the Targaryens and the Blackfires potentially. So there's a lot going on here. But anyway, those are my thoughts on the three dragon eggs. For me, that actually was the moment that I got most excited when I was reading, and I go, oh, it's 3 dragon eggs, and it just tied things in, because I was hoping we would find out about that, and we did. So that's great, and we might find out more about it, who knows, in part 2 of Fire and Blood, because this only goes up for the first half of the Targaryens rule. We don't know what happens after that. Of Wolf and Raven, 7.99. I think that's Australian dollars. Thank you so much, Robert. Love your work, mate. You're very welcome. Do you think Valerian took Arya to Asshai? Was he attacked by a larger wild dragon? Wyverns inside her. Huge WTF moment. Yeah, so I think we're going to have to come on to this one. Chris Mason, you asked if what my biggest WTF moment from the book was, and I think it has to be this moment with Arya, which we'll come on to in just one second. And you were also asking about the Martell's letter to Aegon, which I covered a little bit ago. But let's do this with Arya. So this is probably the most visceral moment in the book, the most disturbing moment, I think, in the book. We get one of the princesses, Arya, who she's quite a wild child, it has to be said. She's very independent spirited and bored, and so she was growing up in Dragonstone. She didn't want to be on Dragonstone, and she did want to ride a dragon. So she went out, and without telling anyone, she appears to have tried to get onto successfully and bond with Valerian the Black Dread, who is at this stage the biggest, and all through this, the biggest, the oldest, the most fearsome dragon there is. And so she gets onto him and then disappears, and nobody knows where they've gone. And her mother goes off searching all the way across Westeros. The king sends out sort of informants and spies to try and find out where. Maybe they've gone somewhere in Essos. No one can find her anywhere. And then a long time later, Valerian comes back, drops her off to King's Landing, drops her off, and it's immediately obvious she's unwell. And this is when the closest I think that this comes to kind of classic horror, by the way. So if your stomach's easily turned, then feel free to skip for the next minute or so. But she then gets rushed by the Grand Maester and by Septon Bart into a place where they can try and look after her, into an infirmary, and she is burning up. Her body is really hot, and her skin is cracked. It's described as being like pork crackling, just like so burnt up and cracked. And inside her, there are things crawling around, which is really quite horrific. And they try to cool her down by they put her in this ice bath, and that actually it doesn't really work, but she dies. And out of her comes these they're described in a number of horrific kind of ways, but like worms up to the size of an arm with faces and arms and legs, and they appear to be something, and they all die. Incidentally, they're in the ice, they die, so they're clearly creatures of fire. And Septon Bart records all of this and clearly is horrified, and also equally clearly has no explanation for what was going on there. Now, we aren't given an explanation, so we aren't told, but he then goes on, he kind of theorizes that what must have happened was that Valerian must have gone off to old Valyrian. Now, remember, Valerian is the only dragon who actually came from old Valyria, who actually was born there before the doom of Valyria. The other dragons that came across with the Targaryens, they actually were born hatched on Dragonstone. So Valerian the Black Dread is the only one that actually had any memory of Valyria, old Valyria. And so the theory is that when Arya climbed onto him, she couldn't control him because it was her first time trying to ride a dragon, and he is this ancient, magical, uncontrollable beast, and so he flies off where he wants to, and she can't control it, and they end up going back to where he came from. And something happened there. Something attacked him, left a huge gouge in his side, and she ended up in this horrific condition, and then he seems to have brought her back. So there seems to be enough of a bond for him to realize that this was an issue. So what attacked Valerian? What was going on with Arya? Again, we do not know. This is something that has been deliberately left vague by George R.R. Martin. It's clear to me, though, that there is and it's increasingly clear, I think, through Fire and Blood, that we think of dragons, but dragons aren't the only things in the sort of the dragon genus, the dragon family, as it were. There are wyverns that we hear a lot of talk, or wyverns we hear a lot of talk of in this book, and it appears that there are quite a few of them over in Essos. These seem to be of the same kind of family. I think it would make an absolute sense that if these are creatures of absolute heat, that they would be living somewhere volcanic, which is what old Valyria was. It was built on 14 volcanoes. So that makes entire sense. And if they found a home in somebody who is Valyrian and has, therefore, we don't know all of the ins and outs of how Targaryen bodies work, but there's clearly some sort of heat resistance. They're not immune to fire by any means, but there's clearly some sort of heat resistance going on there that might make them a good home. So that's what I think was going on. I think that they did indeed go to old Valyria. I think that there was something really quite big which attacked Valerian. Probably something, doesn't have to be another dragon, but something of that ilk. And then smaller things attacked and infected her area. So I think that's what was going on there. And I think it's been left deliberately vague to show that this is a bigger world that we've got out there. Maura Lee, thank you so much. $25. That's very kind. No question, just a thank you for all the wonderful content. Loved Frankenstein. Looking forward to Conan next week. Yes, so this is my second channel. Thank you so much, Maura. That's very kind. I did answer your questions at the beginning of this. I don't know whether or not you were here for that. So maybe if you watch it back later, you'll get my answers to your questions. But in terms of Frankenstein, this is on my second channel, The Well Told Tale, which is just me reading what I consider to be the best science fiction and fantasy stories ever written, long form, averaging about 45 minutes per episode, just me reading the story. We've just finished Frankenstein this week, and next week we're going to be doing a book. Well, it's more of a novella, really, one of the Conan stories, one of the originals. So it's not the movies, but the actual original Robert E. Howard stories. So we're going to do one of them, and then after that, my patrons over there are going to be deciding what we go on and do after that. So thank you, Maura. That's really good, and thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the Frankenstein. I've really enjoyed reading it as well, I have to say. Let's just have a couple of quick questions from the chat. Alexandra Sandu, did fire-breathing dragons exist before they were tamed or bred by Valyrians, a shy people? We don't know. Again, this is lost in the mist of time, but I think probably yes. They do seem to have been there for forever, as far as we can tell. I think that they were one of the old races who were there. Lots of people saying Happy Thanksgiving, which is great. And Team Sansa. I have no idea why people are talking about Sansa. Sansa is obviously not in this book, but I'm coming around to Sansa. I'm quite a fan. Lucy Malik 90. Can someone tell me about the 3 sails that went to the Sunset Sea? I read that little excerpt in the Song of Ice and Fire forum, and it was only in Spanish. Was it real or something fake? Right. So this is building on something, and thank you for that. That's a really good question. This is building on something that we were talking about a moment ago with the 3 dragon eggs, and I mentioned that Elissa Farmen bought a boat. Now that's kind of underplaying it. She commissioned Bravos, who have got the greatest shipwrights and the greatest arsenal in the world, to be building a boat which could take her across the Sunset Sea. And this is described as being an immense boat. It's got sails that can catch the winds to make it go faster than almost any other boats. And so anyway, she gets this, and the goes down and sets off from Old Town in the end, and a couple of the high towers go with her in their own ships. So we had 3 ships heading off west. This, incidentally, is something that's come up a lot more in the book than I was expecting. I was expecting a lot of the focus to be on the east, because obviously that's where the Targaryens came from, and there is, but there's also a surprising amount of talk about the Sunset Sea and heading west. A lot of people heading west when they can. So these 3 ships all head off. Now, they keep going for a long time. There's a big storm. One of the ships goes. There's another big storm, and the second ship, these are the 2 high tower ships, is faltering quite a bit, and they decide to stop off at some islands that they find, and eventually decide to turn around, head off back down via Sothrius, the southern continent, and then head back up again. And that's where they return. The 3rd boat, which is the boat that we are talking about, which was built in Bravos, that keeps on going west. Now, that perhaps is the last we would have heard of it, but because it doesn't come back. We do not know what is the other side of the Sunset Sea. This is what we've been told for so long, because they do not come back. However, we get an intriguing hint, let's say, and it's an intriguing hint with some actually quite significant implications, which is we hear a lot of stories of sea voyages, and there was one, the Valerians, also the Celtigars, do a lot of sailing, and there's one particular Valerian, I've forgotten his name for the moment. There's a lot of new names in this, guys. Just to warn you, we can drown in the new names, and I'm feeling very sorry for people like Gemma, who, as I said, unfortunately can't be here today, who keep their family trees up to date of what's going on in Game of Thrones, because there are a lot of new names on this one. But anyway, we get this sailor who heads off to the far east and goes further east than anyone from Westeros has gone before, and ends up in a shy, and swears on his return that he saw that same boat that went west. Now, this is hearsay of hearsay, because this is somebody writing a history and quoting somebody else who says that they saw something that nobody else can verify, so we don't know this. But if this is true, the implication is that that boat headed west, and then it came back on the east and landed up in Ashai. Now, that to me is important, not just because we're proving that, you know, Planetos flat earthers are wrong, that it is a globe, but it's also proving, I think, that everything is joined up, and therefore, when we're trying to talk about or think about how the White Walkers, the others, might have brought about the long night across the world when there was this big sea in the way, or the narrow sea in the way, actually that's not an issue, because if they're up north, they could come down anywhere. And therefore, when we get all of the stories and the rumors across to the far east of the long night, they are probably actually remembering the same thing, not just memories from Westeros, but because the others probably came down across the planet at the same time. So, as I say, it's a small thing which might have quite significant implications. So Nicola Jurican talking about dragons with different color flames. Now, this is something that, again, you guys in the chat, I knew it would happen. You guys in the chat are coming up with some really interesting points here. I tried to keep a note of and failed partway through, but I tried to keep a note of all the different colors of dragon flame that we read about in this, because we think of dragon flame probably because watching Game of Thrones, the TV show, it just seems to be normal sort of red fiery flame, but that is not the situation that we see in Fire and Blood. Valerian the Black Dread appears to breathe black flame, and when he was fighting one of the other dragons, whose name again I've forgotten, lots of new names, that dragon breathed flame that was described as almost white. And then, yes, we get talk of blue flames as well. So what we see is that dragons breathing out different color flames. What does that mean? I don't think it means that it's just a pretty thing. I think it probably has a significance for in terms of what types of different flames there are and what they do. Probably has some suggestion of what the heat is. So Valerian's flame is generally considered to be like the hottest that there was. It melted Harrenhal, for example, so it was pretty fierce, and black seems to work there. But whether there's a sort of a gradation of these, or if it's just that different dragons of different colors have different flame, we don't know. Dragon lore is quite an evolving thing in this, so we'll kind of pick it up as we go through it. Let's go back to a couple of other questions from my patrons. So Billy, hi Billy, by the way, welcome, a new patron. I owe you a message, by the way, so do look out for that. I'll send that at some point in the next day or so. But your question was, George sent in an interview that there are some very important bits in Fire and Blood that are relevant to A Song of Ice and Fire, but wouldn't reveal what they are. Anything you pick up on that could come into play for the end of A Song of Ice and Fire? So I think I've mentioned the three things that stuck with me on a first read through. There probably will be more. The first one, this whole idea that the world is round, I think that there are big implications of that. I don't think it will necessarily come up in on the show, but in the books, could we therefore see the White Walkers actually starting to invade Essos as well? It's possible. So that's one thing. The dragon eggs, I think that this hints at a much bigger conspiracy involving Dawn and Braavos and the Targaryens and the Blackfires, than much bigger than we even thought it was to start with. So I think that's another one. And then also this idea that dragons need controlling. As I say, this came up a couple of times in Fire and Blood. We had, first of all, Silverwing, that I talked about, that refused to go north of the wall. We had Valerian the Black Dread, who went off out of control and went wherever Valerian wanted to go. And we had another couple of examples of dragons just doing what they want to do. It's a message which is very clear. We kind of instinctively think dragons do what they're told, but they don't. They do what they're told as long as it's what they want. And when it's not what they want, they do what they do want to do. They're only then they're not horses or dogs to be trained. They are independent and very intelligent beings. So Marina and the Almonds, Dawn seems to want a Targaryen restoration. Yes, I agree. I think this is a key part of what's going on there. Dawn has been working for a Targaryen restoration, and it's one of the things that I noticed when I was reading through the first part of Fire and Blood, is there's a very clear opposite or a comparison that you can draw between the attitude of Dawn at the very beginning, when the message is very clear. Dawn does not have a king, and it is repeated a few times. Dawn does not have a king. And you compare that to where we are at in A Song of Ice and Fire, when the Dornish, or the Martells anyway, are working very, very strongly in order to restore the king, the Targaryen king. So those are the things that came out for me. And I think there probably will be others. But firstly, some of them will come in second and third read-throughs. Some I'm sure will come from other eagle-eyed people, but also some of them we may not know the importance of them until afterwards. So this is one of the things about foreshadowing, is that we don't know that it's foreshadowing a lot of the time until we see it happen. So there are, for example, there's some talk of queens having their tongues taken out, having lost their children. Now, does this mean is that foreshadowing of Cersei? That's entirely possible. There are hints in the books that she may lose her tongue, but I don't know whether that actually is foreshadowing. That's just it could just be a random story that is there that has some kind of resonances with the story that we're reading now. So there's lots of stuff like that. I imagine there will be some things that we'll only be able to notice looking back and go, so that was what he was doing, because this is very multi-layered writing. Diana Medina, the 3 dragon eggs also hint at the theory that the Red Door is in fact in Braavos, in the House of the Sea Lord. He may be a bigger ally than we originally thought. Yes, I agree completely with that. And that's I actually did a whole video actually on why I thought that the House with the Red Door was in Braavos and in the Sea Lord's Palace. Feel free to go and check that one out if you want. But I think that this shows that the link is there between Braavos and Dawn. I think that is what we're trying to be shown with this. Piano Diva 11, I think George R.R. Martin says at least twice, who can presume to know the heart of a dragon in this book? Exactly. This is one of the themes which is coming out through this, is that George R. R. Martin is wanting us to understand that dragons are independent. They're not just like things that you can jump on and do as you will. And perhaps that will have some implications for A Song of Ice and Fire. We've still got 2 dragons there who need to have riders. And on the show, obviously, we've still got 1 that still needs a rider. Does this mean that there will be some people who attempt and fail? We certainly had that in The Song of Ice and Fire when we had Quentin Martell going over, poor Quentin, who went over and tried to tame a dragon and failed miserably. So it's very much a matter of dragons are not just creatures that you can do with as you will, and that's where Dragonbinder incidentally comes in, and why Dragonbinder is so important, because this is a horn that allegedly can control dragons. Bree B refused or couldn't go beyond the wall. Yes, that's the big question. I would agree with that in terms of this going back to Silverwing, whether or not why it didn't go beyond the wall. It wasn't made clear whether it was because there was a magic preventing it from, or whether it just decided it didn't want to. And George R. R. Martin has left that deliberately clear. Let's take a very quick pause, as I normally do, just to talk about stuff that's coming up. I've already talked actually about some of it. So in terms of the Well-Told Tale, please do go and check that out. But in terms of Fire and Blood, in case you're interested in how I'm going to be dealing with this, I'm going to be doing a series of videos. I think I'm going to do probably a first video at some point over the weekend, which just gives my top 10 takeaway points or something along those lines from Fire and Blood, once I've had another chance to flick through it again after this and reflect on a few of the points that you've been making in the chat. I just want to set out what I think are some of the key takeaway points. And then after that, I'm going to be doing videos. I was originally thinking of doing them by each king, but I think actually, for reasons I'll give in a moment, I think I'm going to do it partly on each king, but partly on characters, not necessarily kings, sometimes queens, sometimes situations, and I'm going to work my way through them. So I think probably for the next couple of months, you can expect to see, I will carry on doing the Traveler's Guide, I will carry on doing these live streams. I'm definitely going to have 2 or 3 more live streams thinking about issues to do with Fire and Blood, and I'm going to carry on doing the it'll probably be a couple of weeks between episodes, but my series on Robert's Rebellion and the Tower of Joy, because I've nearly reached the end of it now. We nearly got to the Tower of Joy. So don't worry, I'm still going to carry on and finish off that one. But my main focus in terms of theory and explanation videos over the next couple of months or so, it's going to be Fire and Blood and digging through the Targaryen family history and what it might mean for the story. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next while. Sword in the Darkness, thank you so much for the super chat. Is it possible, if dragon eggs hatch best on Dragonstone, that when Illyrio gave Dany the eggs, he didn't think they would hatch unless she got there? I think that when Illyrio gave Dany the eggs, he did not think that they would hatch, full stop. Dragons hadn't hatched by that point for over a century. The dragon eggs that they'd got, they had been just their stone eggs effectively for a couple of centuries. They'd never given any hint that they were going to hatch. I do not think that he was giving them to her because he thought they were going to hatch. I think he was giving them to her as a symbolic gesture to say, these belong to House Targaryen, you have them, you're therefore taking on the sort of the role of House Targaryen, because the dragon eggs would be given to each Targaryen. This was the way that it worked, and this was another incidental that came out from this, was so much of these traditions that we'd vaguely heard of that the Targaryens did. It turns out that they've been doing them at least as far back as this book, and one of them was putting a dragon egg in the crib of a newborn Targaryen, so it could bond with the Targaryens straight away. So giving a dragon egg to a Targaryen was a symbolic thing. In the same way that I think in the books he will symbolically give Blackfyre, the Targaryen family sword, and latterly the Blackfyre family sword, he will give that to Aegon. I think that is what he will be doing, but I don't think he gave the eggs thinking they would hatch. I think he just gave them as a symbol, if that makes sense. Now, Vanessa Amnesty asking about what I think of the succession and the current storyline now that I know the book. This is a big issue. Now, I've probably got a couple of thoughts on this one. And the first one is that we think of the succession quite a lot as being who is next in line, who should inherit. A huge amount of the conflict in this book, and by a huge amount, I would say the majority of the conflict between Targaryens in this book is about disputes about who's next in line. They did not have a clear understanding of the succession in the same way that monarchies in Europe, say, do at the moment. So the monarchy in England, for example, in the United Kingdom, everybody knows who's in line, who's first, second, third, fourth, fifth in line, all the way down, 28th, 116th in line. Everybody knows the exact line of succession. That was not the case for the Targaryens. You see it right from the beginning when you get debates about who should be the heir to Aegon, and then we get the whole issue of that led to the Dance of the Dragons was an issue of succession. It fundamentally, in almost every case, came down to, or does House Targaryen believe in male preference primogeniture? Is it only through the male line that this is passed? So is it only to father to son, or if the son's not there, then moving on to the next male? Or is it the eldest child? If there's a girl or a woman who is the eldest, do they inherit? Or if they then have a son, should that son be in line to inherit? These were the kinds of issues that they were grappling with, and it took them a huge amount of time to actually come to some kind of understanding of it. And whereas Jaehaerys called this great council to try and figure out, because basically he lost all his heirs, and so he called a great council to get everybody to kind of decide who should take over after him. And that kind of established a principle, but then the Dance of the Dragons happened and the whole thing just got pushed out of the window. What really struck me reading this is that of the, 6 or 7 kings that we've got in this, all but 1 or 2 of them actually got there not because everybody recognized that they were next in line, but because they took power by force in one way or another. They grabbed it and they took hold of it. There were other people who claimed to be in line, but they grabbed it and took hold of it. So this is not a very easy line of succession. Now, it will be interesting to see in Fire and Blood Part 2 the extent to which that is sorted out. But my impression is that they still don't sort it out completely, because we have the Blackfyre rebellions are also about who should inherit. And there seems to be this clear understanding that it should be the right person, not just whoever happens to be in line. And so when we come to the succession now, what we're left with, and the show has tried very strongly to make this as clear as possible, because they want a simple story. So they've got rid of Aegon. he complicates things, so they've not worried about that one. With Jon, they have made very clear what happened. In fact, actually, my next video in my my series on Robert's Rebellion and the like is on this very issue. So spoilers, I always always spoil my own videos just before I release them. But on the show, they made it very clear that Rhaegar divorced or had an annulment for his marriage to Elia Martell, and then remarried, and so Jon is therefore very clearly first in line. He is not a bastard. He is actually the heir to the throne. He is in the Targaryen line, and they tried to make that as clear as they possibly could. But in the books, things are not that clear. We've got this character, Aegon, who may or may not be who he says he is. Jon, I suspect we will find it's not quite as, not quite as clear cut as all of that. Is he in line? Is he not in line? I think it'll be a lot less clear. And so we're back to this world of, should it be who theoretically is next in line, or should it be whoever takes hold of power? And so my overall thought on Succession in A Song of Ice and Fire is that actually I really hope, and I think we're going to end up with the point where nobody wins the Iron Throne. The people who want it desperately will be killed or otherwise got rid of, and the people who don't want it will be left there. And I think that is where we're going to end up. I don't think that the moral of A Song of Ice and Fire is that the Game of Thrones is something that somebody wins at the end. I think the moral, one of the many morals, is that you do not win the Game of Thrones. Everybody loses the Game of Thrones. But this brings me on to my second point. I said I had 2 points about that. And that was the other big takeaway, the big message that I've got from this book, is that this is showing a lot more that this isn't just, history of Westeros is not just about the history of kings. This is about not just men, it's also the women. The women are at the fore of this book. We didn't really pick up on it before, but a lot of the time when we get Dance of the Dragons, the two principal characters are not the sons, the king, potential kings. It's the two mothers who are fighting it out effectively. When we get one queen regent who is effectively ruling in place of her son who's not yet come to age, we find that the three original Targaryen invaders, yes, we may have had Aegon having the crown, but that all three of them ruled. When he wasn't there, one of the other two would be sitting in the Iron Throne and would be dispensing justice as an equal. And even when we get to Jaehaerys and Alicent, we find that it is her who is actively involved in ruling the land and coming up with new laws. So, for example, the abolition of the Lord's right to the first night, that came from her, and things like that. So she's very involved in this. So what I think that we have got is we've got I'm tempted to see this as George R.R. Martin flexing some of his feminist muscles. Perhaps it is, or perhaps it's just him fleshing out history and showing us that this isn't just the history of great men doing great deeds. This is a history where everybody's involved. And there are, just while I'm being inclusive on this, there's also a notably much higher number of either overtly or probably gay characters in this, or bisexual characters in this, in a way that previously we haven't had. It's been very clear that that George R.R. Martin is trying to show through this that there is a huge variety of people who are involved, and they're not just this kind of like a homogeneous group of Targaryens who are all exactly the same. Everybody is different, and all different shapes and sizes of people and characters of people are involved and have their own stories. So Vanessa Amnesty saying, I think Targaryen were always up and from until they weren't. Yes, so I think that they have always been up very strong, but in terms of the history, they are always being seen as being slightly below the men because they're not the kings. They're always just like, oh, and there was also whoever. When we list who are the Targaryens, we list down the kings rather than talking about all the other characters. We have to dig into it a little bit to actually get an understanding of all of the different characters. Let's go back to questions from my patrons. Let's see where I got to on this one. Chris Mason, I think I answered your question. Kathy Stark, there are several mentions of silver stags being paid. Struck me as a potential continuity error. What do you think? So this is one of the items of currency in Westeros. Now, there are 3, 4, maybe even 5 different types. We get golden dragons, silver stags, copper pieces, I think, groats and pennies, or copper pennies, groats and half groats, perhaps. And these are, it would appear, they're the same types of currency all the way through. Now, this gets instituted quite on. I think it was Aegon the First who instituted the currencies. Jaehaerys was the person who brought everything together. So he tried to merge all of the laws or get a single legal framework for the Seven Kingdoms going on. And so he also brought in the currencies. So silver stags were around for a while. Whether they were always known by those exact names, I don't know. But I don't think there's a continuity error here. Scotty, Jaehaerys' story of how his great-great-grandsire Jaehaerys flew his dragon north of the wall to defeat a vast host of wildlings, giants, and wargs. This must have happened before the conquest. So that, I think, this was a story which we hear being told by a character quite late on in the book, looking back at Jaehaerys and what Jaehaerys did. I think it was, I won't guess. It was one of the later kings was telling this story just before he died to his grandchildren. Might have been Viserys II, I can't remember. But he was telling the story. I think this is a story. I think this was an embellishment. Jaehaerys didn't go and defeat a massive army of wildlings, giants, and wargs. I think that this is the kind of thing that it's showing George R. R. Martin showing how these stories get embellished and people's histories get embellished over time. It certainly wasn't before the conquest, because Jaehaerys or actually, maybe actually reading that one again, perhaps he was talking about a different Jaehaerys. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think that this was a true story. I think this was an embellishment. Anyway, Sword in the Darkness. Kudos to Simon Vance as the narrator of this book. Hard to replace Ray Dotrice, but Vance did a good job. He sounds like a maester. I haven't actually listened to the audiobooks, so that's really good to hear, guys. That's a recommendation, because this is obviously a new narrator. Now, if you are interested in getting the audiobooks, then again, there's the link down there if you'd like to support the channel at no extra cost to you. I certainly will be buying a copy of it at some point. I just like, for my first read through, I like to actually read it in hard copy, as you see. But it's good to hear that the narrator is a good one. I have heard good things about Simon Vance, so that doesn't surprise me, I have to say. Let's have a quick flick through. Jack Hurst, do we learn any more details on how Valyrian steel is made? No. So the secret of Valyrian steel was lost before the Targaryens came across. So it was lost with the doom of Valyria. So nobody knows how Valyrian steel was made. The only thing that I saw, and again, this is the kind of thing where rereads will probably pick up more bits of information, is that we discovered that Blackfire, the sword, it got impacted or by dragonfire, and it came out darker color than it was before. That implies to me that perhaps the dragonfire itself dictates the color of the Valyrian steel, because Valyrian steel isn't just of one color, it's quite a rippled effect, and you can have different colors to it. So given the fact that we're learning about the different colors of dragon fire, I do wonder whether or not this might be a part of how the different types of Valyrian steel are made, but that's speculation. That's not something that we know. That we didn't learn the secret of Valyrian steel here, unfortunately. I suspect we might never learn the secret of Valyrian steel. Natalie Donald, what was the biggest revelation in the book, in your opinion? And has anything revealed in the book changed your opinion on anything in the current story? So I think I've wrapped up most of this one already. I think the biggest reveal was about the 3 dragon eggs. Not just because it's an interesting story. There are other things like the world probably being round that is quite big, but at the same time, it's still quite hearsay, and we shouldn't necessarily take that kind of thing exactly right. The things like the horrible area with all the yucky stuff under her skin, that was a WTF moment, but for me that didn't change huge amounts. I think that's just so probably old Valeria's got some bad stuff going on. We probably knew that already. So I for me, it was the 3 dragon eggs was the biggest thing. And as I said, I think that's just, for the books, shows a whole lot more of an extra layer to the link between Braavos and Dorne. Pardon me. June Coates, a Targaryen princess with mismatched eyes and a broken nose. Yes, there was indeed one of them. Is this a red herring in terms of the Tyrion Targaryen theory? Now, yeah, so for those who subscribe to the Tyrion Targaryen theory, then there are quite a lot of bits of evidence here that could potentially back it up. There's more than one Targaryen with mismatched eyes, and there's one who is described here. It's the same. I can't remember the name of the princess. Mismatched eyes, gets a broken nose, and has hair that's described, I think, as straw colored or something like that, rather than the silvery gold hair that many Targaryens have. So I think it probably is George R. R. Martin just trolling us a little bit, but if you're looking for evidence of Tyrion Targaryen, there is some here that might help back it up. Incidentally, just because I thought about it while we're doing this, one of the big takeaways of the fact that there are so many new characters here is that there are a huge amount. Although lots of the Targaryens killed each other in the Dance of the Dragons and so on, there are a huge amount of Targaryen bastards out there. Time after time, we hear of these kings with having bastards all over the place. And so, whereas we often think of the Targaryen bloodline as being very rare, actually it probably isn't. It's probably spread out a huge amount more than we might think. There are probably a lot more people out there with it. And so I've said this a number of times before, but if you just take Daenerys, for example, she's actually only something like 1/8 pure Targaryen. There's a huge amount of other families that have married in that means that Valyrian stock, if that's how you'd want to describe it, is perhaps not as pure as you might otherwise think. There are others who may be just as Valyrian as she is. And just on another, I don't think there's a huge any huge implications to this, but it's quite an interesting one. When we get the story after the Dance of the Dragons, when we get Cregan Stark, who was the Lord of Winterfell, who came down and kind of missed the whole war. It's quite an amusing thing. So he comes down with a huge army from the north, and then comes in and basically bosses it in King's Landing for a while, because nobody seems to be taking control, and he sees danger all over the place, and he just goes round, and in the same way that probably Ned Stark could have done if he'd had more soldiers, and the situation in King's Landing was a whole lot less strong. Cregan Stark came and just bossed it in King's Landing and executed people and ordered other people to do things, and then he heads back up north with a new wife. He heads back up north, but the interesting bit that I don't think we knew, we might have known, but when he came down with this army, this was the Northmen who had escaped the north just as winter has come, and they didn't want to return north because they knew that there was actually limited amount of food and limited amount of warmth, and limited amount of space in the castles and things like that. So if the entire army went back up north, then they would actually not be welcome. They had made an active decision that they were marching to war, and they probably wouldn't all come back. So what they did was that the army that marched down south, a lot of them stayed down south and married the widows of all of the people down south who died in the war. And so what we actually have is a huge amount of first men families, or half first men families, who will have suddenly appeared in the Riverlands a couple of hundred years before Song of Ice and Fire. As I say, I don't think it hugely impacts on the story, but it's just an interesting little anecdote to show us that First Men blood is not just where we think it might be. Targaryen blood is not just where we think it might be. There's a lot more intermingling going on than you might otherwise imagine. Okay, so I think that's all of my questions from my patrons. Guys, I'm going to go for about another 10 more minutes, but now is your time to be dropping any final questions into the chat. And what I'll do in the meantime, while you do that, is I will have a quick go through and answer as few other let me start again. I will go and answer as many questions as I can, as swiftly as I can. So Piano Diva 11, Cregan's scene flirting with Black Ali was so much fun. I agree. I really enjoyed that one. Antique Gamer, there are two heads of the dragon, known by Danny and John. Who is the third head of the dragon going to be? Now, I think this is going to be... I'm not sure if I can give a short answer on this one. I think that this will be opened to interpretation. I think some people will see that it might be Aegon or Fagon. I think some people will see that this is going to be the Dragon Riders, one of whom is the Night King, and so the others would be John and Danny. You might also look at it as being the third character is Tyrion, because Tyrion has got the echoing storyline of the orphan child brought up not knowing all of the details of their history, and there are huge amounts of echoes between the three. So I think the third head of the dragon is one of these things that is going to be left open to interpretation afterwards, in the same way that Azor Ahai is going to be. What else have we got? Anime Lover says, in the book, I think Tyrion ate a baby in the belly and is now part Lannister, part Targaryen. In the show, whole Lannister. It's a good theory. I like that one. I've not really thought about that. What else have we got? Lots of thoughts about Tyrion and the Targaryens. Jim Fox says Tyrion is a Targaryen, I think, in the books. Yeah, I definitely don't think he will be in the show. That I am very clear about. I think it's possible in the books. I think not in the books. I think it's possible in the books, but definitely not in the show. Vanessa Amnesty says it's a bittersweet ending if we get rid of Dany and Tyrion. It is a bit Disney, but not impossible. The similarities between the Conquerors and the current Starks is hard to ignore. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities going on. Antique Gamer talking about the idea of 300 years ago, Westeros needed to be taken over to save Westeros. There are clear echoes between that first invasion and what happens with Dany. We've got the 3 dragons coming across. I think that they will be landing again on the show. They obviously started on Dragonstone. I think that that's going to be happening probably again in the books. So, and I think that we will get Aegon the First being the king who created the Iron Throne, and I think we will find Daenerys will be the queen who destroys or ends the Iron Throne. I think that is where the symmetry is going to be coming in. Karen Pierre, who are your favorite new characters or newly fleshed out characters? I love Oakenfist, Alan, Valerian, as well as the twins, Baela and Rhaena. How about you? It's a good one. I think I like Mushroom, who we knew about before, but we get a whole lot more about Mushroom, and I think I like him even more because Archmaester Gildane doesn't like him. I think that really appeals to me, is that he keeps on quoting him even though he doesn't like him. I love the first 3 Targaryens. Their dynamic, we knew a lot about it already, but their dynamic worked really well for me on a read through of this. I should say, for those who don't know, that the first chunks of this book, chunks of Fire and Blood, are not quite cut and pasted, but taken out from the World of Ice and Fire, particularly the first bit about Aegon's conquest. A lot of that is not new information, but rereading that through that, I loved that. And I also, Septon Bart is a character who I thought I would like, and now I like even more, having read more about him. So he's probably now going to be one of my new favorite characters. Alison has a book. This is Piano Diva 11. Alison has a line where she realizes that in their family, she is Rhaenys and Rhaena is Visenya. Makes me want to look for more trios in other spots since these things repeat. Yeah, there's a lot of trios going on. And it's when they do quite a lot, the Targaryens look back and try and compare themselves to their predecessors, and that's a thing that has carried on into A Song of Ice and Fire, is people trying to compare themselves one to another. One of the things about Jaehaerys was this big effort on his part not to be like his father, Aegon II, because he was a very weak king, and Jaehaerys was wanting to show that he was a strong king, and other people were very clear that they wanted him to be, and so he deliberately went out, like Rhaegar. It's quite reminiscent of Rhaegar, actually. He deliberately went out, having been quite bookish is probably the wrong word for it, but not being very martial. He went out and taught himself how to be a good fighter, and that has, as I say, it has resonances of Rhaegar, but it was done in reaction to who he did not want to be in terms of his ancestors. Last couple of quick thoughts going. If Targaryen rule is going to be to bring peace to the realm, Viserys will help that happen. I'm not sure about which context this one is in, but I don't think that Targaryen rule brings peace to the realm. I think one of the other big takeaways from Fire and Blood is that although, yes, there are some parts of the story where there is peace, some parts of the reign of Jaehaerys and Alicent, there is peace. It's not That's not the normal way of things. Having a united kingdom in Westeros of the Seven Kingdoms, there were always wars going on. They were always fighting each other or rebels. It wasn't just in the last few years that that's been happening. This has been a constant through, and even strong kings were always facing threats from somewhere. There was no golden age where the Targaryen rule meant that there were no rebellions. There were always rebellions going on. Winter's here saying, can you quickly explain Fagon? I can, and I am going to do a video on him very soon. Fagon is a name given within the community to a character who appears in the books, who claims, or it is claimed for him, that he is Aegon, who is Prince Rhaegar's eldest son, who was everybody thought had been killed by the Mountain during Robert's Rebellion, but he claims that he was whisked off and saved, and now he is coming back to claim the throne that is rightfully his. So that's who he is. He's quite a big character in the book, and he has launched an invasion in the book. And so that's what's going on there. And the big question is he really who he thinks he is, or is he just being put up by some other people, being Illyrio and Varys, for example? Okay, guys, I think I'm going to end it there. What I'm going to do, as I said, is I'm going to go back through this, have another read through it, come up with another few thoughts and ideas. My next video I'm going to be doing on this will be something along the lines of, here's my top takeaway points from Fire and Blood. But thank you so much to you. Happy Thanksgiving again, if it is Thanksgiving for you. Thank you to everyone in the chat. There were some fantastic questions. I learned a lot from your questions as well. So let's keep the dialogue going, and let's keep on sharing the stuff that we've learned from this big book, lots of information, and we'll get to the bottom of it quicker if we're all sharing these ideas. Thank you particularly for the super chats. Patrons, always say this, I cannot do this without you. There's new material coming for you this week. If you're at all interested in supporting the channel or getting access to some exclusive content, please check out my Patreon page. There's a link down there. Otherwise, take care, guys, and I shall see you next week.